is one that is rather significant. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a legislative amendment which approves the waiver for India for the S400 deal. It is a missile system, a missile defense system deal with Russia. It was authored, this entire amendment to the act was authored and introduced by an Indian-American Congressman, Ro Khanna. That amendment urges the Biden administration to use its authority to provide India with a sanctions waiver to help deter aggressors like China. So in that context, from a strategic standpoint, it's a rather crucial one for India, this waiver coming from the US at this point in time. Let's get perspective on this. We have guests joining us on India tonight. Maroof Raza is a consultant, a strategic affairs expert. Great to have you on the show. And Michael Kugelman is also joining us. He's Senior Associate for South Asia, Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Michael, thanks for making the time for joining us too. First to you, this waiver for the Indo-Russian missile defense system deal is coming through an amendment to an American act, the CAATSA, the Act to Counter America's Adversaries Through Sanctions, which was brought in to counter America's adversaries through sanctions. It has been used to impose sanctions on countries that purchase major defense hardware from Russia. And that's exactly what India has done. So, in a way, this waiver clearly positions the US's stand in supporting India against China, and they're putting this above their own law. Walk us through the strategic importance in doing this from an American perspective.
Yes, so thanks for having me. I should say, first off, just to clarify, that the U.S. government has not formally agreed to provide a waiver to India just yet. And as you know, the House of Representatives has now essentially urged President Biden to use his authority to make sure that that waiver comes in. And my view is eventually there will be a CAATSA waiver for India. But for this to be final, for this to be a done deal, President Biden needs to sign off on it. So, even if the Senate, which is going to be taking a look at this legislation next, even if the U.S. Senate agrees with the House of Representatives and passes this motion, Biden is the one that has to weigh in. But I do think we are headed in that direction. And indeed, it's true. I mean, as you note, the U.S. has acted against one key partner, that being Turkey, a NATO ally, because of acquisitions that Turkey had made from Russia. But I think that we're looking at a very different situation with India and its S400 acquisition from Russia. I mean, the CAATSA legislation says that in order for a country to get a waiver, a CAATSA waiver, the U.S. government must make a compelling case that national security interests require it. And in the case of India, there is wide, strong, multi-partisan support in Washington around the idea that India serves a critical role for U.S. national security interests and serving as a partner to work with the U.S. to counter China. That's very clear. There's strong support for that. And I would also argue that in Washington, there would be recognition that even though India continues to depend heavily on Russian arms, it has reduced its share of Russian arms acquisitions in recent years. That'll be a key point right there as well. And finally, I think that Washington also would recognize that the S-400 system will likely be used in some way to strengthen India's capacity to deter China. And that serves a U.S. national security to deter China, just like the U.S. wants to strengthen its own capacity to deter China. So I think, bottom line, eventually we will formally see the U.S. government agree to provide a CAATSA waiver to India, but we're not there just yet.
Thanks for the clarification. This has to be signed off, like we hear from Michael Maroof. That waiver has to be signed off by Biden, but if it does come through, how much would it be a result of Indian diplomacy and the effectiveness with which India has been dealing with the U.S. in recent times? Because there have been certain critical differences, too, that the two countries have had when it comes to other issues like trade tariff, with questions on human rights, etc. In what ways do you see this kind of waiver, when it happens, helping India, both strategically and economically?
Well, Michael's made some very strong points as how Washington would look at it, but let me try and sort of put it in perspective from the Indian side. The first thing is that I think people in America are getting around to accepting the fact that it cannot be you're either with us or against us kind of phenomena that Washington normally imposes on its friends and allies. In the case of India, India has stuck to its guns. when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, India has said that it will make its own choices based on its own strategic concerns. One example is that India chose to buy Russian oil at the time when sanctions were being imposed on Russia from across the world. The second thing is, as far as the S400 is concerned, it's a multi-set system. It's not just one platform that's going to come to us. It's multiple platforms. The first of that has already begun to arrive in India and is beginning to be put into play in our defense infrastructure. So therefore, if US does impose CAATSA on us, the US would risk losing out on India's engagement with America on a number of other defense-related initiatives, whether it is the foundation agreements or India buying in platforms and systems under the FMS arrangements with the US, which means direct government-to-government arrangements. And the US has emerged over the last 7 to 10 years as India's largest purchasing partner in terms of weapon systems, though overall the Indian military inventory is still heavily tilted towards the Russians. And this is part of a historical legacy. That's one. The second is we have traditionally had weapons platforms from Russia, which are hardier and cheaper and have manufacturing bases in India. The Sukhoi aircraft is a case in point. The T-72 tanks are a case in point. And we are now looking at, today's news is we are looking at 446 T-90 tanks. So the fact is that we are still going ahead with Russian purchases, but not, in percentage-wise, as CIPRI, the Stockholm-based think tank, has said that while India is decreasing its total purchase from Russia of the variety of items that Indian military systems make up, but India is still continuing to get a lot of big-ticket weapon platforms. For example, the only aircraft carrier that we operate is of Russian origin. The nuclear lease submarine that we operate, which is very important for our second strike capability, is of Russian origin.
Yes.
And the fact that the S-400, the Chinese already have it. We need to counter the Chinese. And it is beyond doubt, most military experts agree, the best anti-air defense system that you can have at this point of time in the world against aircrafts, missiles, bombers, and even UAVs. So there's no way we're going to stop at not buying it, CAATSA or no CAATSA. That's my understanding.
Fair enough. There is so much reliance that India has had on Russia for its defense capabilities. But now this S-400 missile defense system, Russian, it was purchased by India to help deter aggressors like China. Michael, wouldn't the US be keen to sell similar missile defense systems to India instead in their bid to fight Chinese aggression, like the Americans call it? Wouldn't that be a key part of the strategy, like you pointed out? And if so, how do you see them pursuing it in a more holistic way?
No, you're absolutely right. I think that the U.S. has struggled to try to provide alternatives, better alternatives to India, not just in terms of arms shipments, in a sense, trying to be able to provide a better and cheaper alternative to what Russia provides, but also in the context of Russian oil. I think that there's been some concern in Washington about India's decision to keep importing Russian oil. And yet the United States, this is not known by many, but last year India was the top destination for U.S. oil exports. But the cost issue is what's at play. In other words, if the U.S. could do a better job of convincing India that it can provide cheap oil or more of it, then perhaps that would compel India to import less cheap oil from Russia. But I think the issue of oil is less important here in Washington, just because India doesn't really rely heavily on Russia to meet its oil needs, but it depends heavily on Russia for its arms needs. So that's the bigger issue. So this is a long-term challenge. And I do know that recent high-level discussions between US and Indian officials, including the most recent 2+2 meeting, did get into this issue where the US side tried to project itself to India as a better longer-term security partner to India than Russia could be, and that in due course, the U.S. will be in a position to be able to produce the types of platforms and other types of weaponry that India may have for quite some time depended on Russia for. But indeed, at this point at least, the U.S. doesn't have that much to offer, or doesn't have anything that would be seen as superior to what Russia has offered to India for so long. So that's going to require some time to work out, but it is a very top goal of U.S. officials to try to make that argument to India that not now, but as we get further into the longer term, the U.S. would be able to provide more with the hopes that that could, in due course, wean India off of its longstanding dependence on Russian arms. But there's a recognition that this would have to be a long game. Nothing is going to happen quickly. It will take a fair amount of time.
Given, but perhaps this is the beginning of that much more closer partnerships in trying to fend off the challenge that China poses to India. And for strategic reasons that the U.S. has too, this works well both for India and the U.S. And how much further it goes beyond such defense deals, that too is going to be on our radar. Maroof and Michael, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective on this.